Hi everyone, welcome back to a new video comparison by Mirror Lessons. As a complement to my 100-400mm review that I published earlier, I had the chance to compare this lens with another popular super zoom for micro four third, the Panasonic 100-300mm. While the 100-400mm is brand new, the 100-300mm is actually more than 5 years old. It was announced in September 2010 and you can now find it for an average price of $500, which is less than 1/3 the price of the 100-400mm. So we can naturally expect a lot of differences between these two lenses given the 5 years gap between them. The question is, how well the 100-300mm can keep up? Let's find out. The most noticeable difference between these two lenses is the size and weight. The 100-400mm is almost double the weight. It is also larger and longer than the 100-300mm. The 100-300mm is definitely more portable and can be used more easily on smaller micro four thirds camera like for example the EM10 Mark II. The 100-400mm is more comfortable to use with a high-end micro four third camera like the Panasonic GH4, GX8 or the Olympus OMD M1. The 100-400mm features a premium metal finish and comes with a metal hood and a tripod mount. It is weather sealed against dust and water. The 100-300mm is mostly made of plastic on the outside and there is rubber on the zoom ring. It comes with a plastic hood and the lens is not weather sealed. The 100-400mm has some unique features that make it easier to use for more advanced and professional photographers. We found 3 switches on the side to limit the focus distance, choose between autofocus and manual focus, and activate or deactivate the optical stabilization. There is a lock ring to lock the zoom ring at any focal length you wish. The hood is positioned on a sliding ring and you can move its position back and forth. The 100-300mm only has an optical stabilization switch. Finally, because of the weight and larger size, the 100-400mm comes with a clever tripod mount mechanism. You can attach it easily and rotate the lens to portrait orientation without changing the position of the switches on the side. The new 100-400mm is a lens designed by Leica in partnership with Panasonic. It has a non-constant aperture of f4 to 6.3. The fastest aperture at 300mm is f5.6 and it matches the same aperture we find on the 100-300mm. The 100-300mm is a Panasonic design only. In terms of 35mm format equivalence, the 100-400mm gives you the same angle of view as a 200-800mm. The 100-300mm will give you a 200-600mm focal length equivalence. So of course the 100-400mm gives you that extra reach that can be useful for wildlife photography. Okay, so what I described just now is one of the obvious differences that you could figure out yourself. But what about optical quality? The first set of comparisons shows the performance between these two lenses at 300mm. The results are quite clear here. The 100-400mm is sharper at f5.6 and f8. The performance between the two is slightly closer from f11, but here diffraction starts to appear. However, the 100-400mm suffers less from diffraction and the difference remains visible even at f22. At 200mm, the advantage of the 100-400mm is once again clear. At f5, it outperformed the 100-300mm and is slightly sharper at f8 too. From f11, the 100-400mm maintains that slight advantage up to f22. At 100mm, the performance at f4 and f5.6 between the two lenses is more similar. At f8, surprisingly, the 100-300mm seems to have a slight advantage. From f11, the performance remains basically identical. The 100-400mm can focus as close as 1.3 meters at all focal lengths. This means that at 400mm you can get quite close to your subject. The 100-300mm can focus as close as 1.5 meters and as you can see, the magnification factor is slightly lower. Concerning the bokeh, both lenses perform in a very similar way. This is actually interesting because in my 100-400mm review I stated that the bokeh, despite not being perfect, has some character. Well, when I compare it to the 100-300mm, the difference isn't as pronounced as you might think. We can distinguish some double images and hard edges on both, but overall the performance is very similar. Both lenses can suffer from purple veiling flare, and the 100-400mm can also display some greenish ghost flare. The 100-400mm shows almost no trace of chromatic aberration. The 100-300mm has more, but chromatic aberration can easily be removed in a raw developer software. Finally, both lenses show some slight vignetting at the fastest aperture and longest focal length. The 100-300mm is a little bit weaker in this regard. Because of the 5 years gap between these two lenses, the 100-400mm of course has more modern technology. For example, the autofocus motor is compatible with the 240 frames per second IF drive that with selected Lumix cameras gives you more speed and precision. In single autofocus, the difference is less noticeable, but the 100-400mm is slightly faster on the Lumix GX8. The 100-300mm also makes more noise when focusing, while the 100-400mm is completely silent. In continuous autofocus, there is a substantial difference. Because of the IF drive compatibility, the 100-400mm allows you to take more shots in one burst. With the Leica lens, the IF performance was more accurate and consistent. With birds in flight, my findings are very similar. I had more interesting results and more constant behavior in terms of sharpness and autofocus accuracy with the 100-400mm. With the OMD M1, the performance of the two lenses is slightly closer, but once again the 100-400mm makes a difference when shooting in continuous autofocus and high burst mode. The 100-400mm features power optical image stabilization, while the 100-300mm features mega optical image stabilization. Mega optical stabilization is just an older generation of the Panasonic optical stabilization for its Lumix lenses. I found that the 100-400mm has more or less a one-stop advantage in comparison to the 100-300mm. As you can see, I managed to get a perfectly sharp image at 1/15 of a second with the 100-400mm compared to only 1/25 of a second with the 100-300mm. The 100-400mm is also compatible with the dual image stabilization system of the Panasonic GX8, where both the sensor and optical stabilization are used. Unfortunately, the 100-300mm is not compatible. However, as stated in my review, the dual image stabilization doesn't give a substantial advantage when shooting at the extreme focal length. Of course, for a real-world shoot, it is better to use faster shutter speeds to ensure sharpness at the longest focal length, even with static subjects. I advise that you use at least 1/200 of a second with the 100-400mm and 1/400 of a second with the 100-300mm. Both lenses work well for 4K shooting, and as expected, the 100-400mm gives you slightly sharper results once more. As you can see, the autofocus motor of the 100-400mm makes the lens slightly faster in continuous autofocus in video mode too. The focus ring is smoother on the 100-400mm if you prefer manual focus. On my 100-300mm copy, I found the focus ring quite stiff. The optical image stabilization on both lenses can produce some jittering which, depending on the situation, can be unpleasant, especially at the longest focal length. The 100-400mm power optical image stabilization is more effective, but I advise you to use a monopod at the very least with both products. The best results will be achieved with a proper video tripod and a fluid head. At the extreme focal length, every little movement, including soft wind, can produce shaky footage. It is clear that the new 100-400mm has many advantages. It is sharper, focuses faster, and has a more effective optical stabilization system. It also has a more robust and weather-sealed build quality. The 100-300mm is of course more affordable, and the quality is more than decent if we consider the 5-year gap. Its price is an advantage for someone who wants to start using a super telephoto lens and gather experience before investing in a more expensive lens. Its smaller size is also an advantage with smaller micro four thirds cameras. As usual, don't hesitate to leave a comment on this YouTube video if you have any questions. Please subscribe to our channel, and of course you can visit miolesson.com where you will find comparison images available at the full resolution. Thank you for watching and see you soon. Bye bye!